Our first major assignment is the press review. Normally we would have an essay each week, but for the first week we're going to do this instead. The reason is this is basically a how-to for researching and vetting your sources, and research is one of the main focuses of Comp 2, so I thought we'd cover research in depth before we jumped into writing essays that relied upon research. The press review is basically a research assignment over a handful of news websites. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to pick 4 news websites off of a list of 9 that I provide at the end of this assignment sheet. And for the 4 news websites you pick, you're going to pick 3 recent articles each, so 12 articles total from each website. You're going to read those articles, and using material from those articles, you are going to evaluate each news website for 2 things: bias and credibility. Bias, in this case, means left versus right, progressive versus conservative, liberal versus Republican. Now I've started mixing up my dyads. Democrat versus Republican, so on and so forth, right? And credibility means journalistic integrity and value. The example that I used in class was the New York Times, which is one of the websites on our list. The New York Times is generally thought of as being kind of middle left leaning, and is also generally thought of as fairly credible, if not very credible, because of their long history of producing award-winning journalists and being reputable in terms of fact-checked and peer-reviewed, not literally peer-reviewed the way a scientific article is, but supported by the industry in general, as in the New York Times, typically things that they write are picked up by other news outlets and vetted for accuracy and then found to be accurate and thus passed on. So things of that nature are what we talk about when we talk about the credibility of a news website. And in this case, I want you to use the minimum of 3 articles per news website to try and get an idea of how biased they are in one direction or the other, and how credible that news outlet is. When we're looking at the articles themselves, I give you a short list of items that you can look at in the articles to determine what the news outlet is like in terms of those 2 factors, bias and credibility. The first is byline. You can research the author of any given article on any given news site out there and get an idea of that author's experience and credentials, and thus how suited they may be to be writing about the topic they're writing about. For example, if you see an article on a news website about the war in Afghanistan, the ongoing conflict there, and you see that it's written by someone who has just retired from the Navy and was an admiral in the Navy running support operations off the coast of Saudi Arabia for troops in Afghanistan for 7 years, then that person probably has some credibility to write about that subject because they clearly have experience in that field. So you can always research the byline, the author of a particular article, and find out, excuse me, how much experience that person has. That can be a clue to how you want to evaluate the website the news website that they're writing for. Secondary sources. Anytime a news article has links to other sources, it's a good idea to check those out. Not only to fact check the article itself, but to see what type of sources they are relying on. For example, if I write a news article and publish it in the New York Times, and I have a lot of sources, but those sources all go back to like Matthew Cherry's Bird blog, or Wikipedia, or an email that my sister sent me 5 years ago, then those aren't really credible sources. Versus if I'm citing the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control, or a double-blind meta-study done by The Lancet, which is a major medical publication in Britain, that covered 10 years and 100,000 people, or a quote from an expert in the field, things of that nature. So the quality of the sources that you find in the article itself is a major clue to its credibility. Length is tricky because, as a general rule, the longer an article is, the more nuanced and the more in-depth it's going to be, but not always. It's just kind of a hard and fast metric. So in terms of length, I would typically say if all 3 of the articles you grab from a website are kind of short and don't really get too in depth in their topic, versus another news website where all three of the articles you grab are pretty lengthy and pretty detailed. That shows you kind of the scope of those two news websites. One of them is more interested in providing details and a clear coverage of the issues, whereas the other one maybe isn't. And that says something about that news outlet. Tone is more of a subjective quality. It can be something like a feeling you get when you're reading an article that the writer wants you to react a certain way or that they're angling for a certain way. Tone is also something that can be either academic and dry and kind of fact-based or more emotional and fiery. Tone is the difference between a sermon you hear at a place of worship versus the text you send your best friend on Saturday night, right? There's very different tones depending on the type of writing we're looking at, and different articles on different news outlets are going to have a very different approach in terms of tone. The last element, and I didn't say this in class, but this is very important, opposing argument. If a news article is good at considering opposing argument, then that is a mark in its favor, because it shows that the writer is either open-minded and or clever enough and has done enough work to consider the other side of the issue and address it when they are making their own points. Either way, those are both good indicators in favor of the journalist and thus in favor of the news outlet. Because it's really easy if, let's say I'm writing an article about how pigeons are evil and they should all be eradicated because they're just sky rats. It would be really easy for me just to come up with examples of pigeons pooping on statues or stealing the bread out of your child's hand or generally just being disgusting birds. But it would be a lot more nuanced and a lot more work for me to then go into the good points about pigeons. They eat harmful insects and I have no idea, there's nothing good about pigeons. But if there were, and I was writing an article about how pigeons are bad, it would be good for me rhetorically as a writer to consider the other side of the argument, because it makes me look more balanced. And whether I'm doing that just as a clever trick to try and make my own side stronger, or whether I'm doing it because I really am open-minded, in either case, that shows that I am doing harder work and trying to be more diligent as a writer. So pay attention to if the articles you see consider opposing argument at all. I list the OWL at Purdue, the online writing lab at Purdue, for our go-to source as an MLA format guide. The reason this is important for our press review is because you are going to cite all 12 articles that you use for this assignment in MLA format on a Works Consulted page. Not Works Cited, but Works Consulted. And I have an example of it here. Now, this is not double-spaced, but in all other ways, because I wanted it all to be on one page, but in all other ways, this is the proper format for a Works Cited or Works Consulted entry. And that is all available on the OWL at Purdue. Finally, I have the list of items, the list of news sites that you can pick from. There are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you will choose four, and you will choose 3 articles, recent articles from each. When I say recent articles, they don't have to be like this week. They can be as old as even like a year or 18 months old. But try to make it, from 2018 or up, and I get that that's maybe potentially 2 years out, but that's totally fine. I'll take anything within the last couple years to give an idea of the article. The reason that we have to have at least 3 from each news outlet is because what if you click on the Wall Street Journal and the first article you grab, just kind of at random, is about Black Lives Matter, right? It's about the protests. And let's say you have a very strong opinion on the protests, and the article you find in the Wall Street Journal is an op-ed piece that goes in the opposite direction, written by someone who has a very strong opinion on the other side of the issue. Well, that may make you think that the Wall Street Journal is, first of all, biased in a specific direction, and second of all, you might be like, hey, I don't agree with this, that's terrible, and you just write it off as no good. Well, what if it turns out that most of what the Wall Street Journal writes actually is very different in terms of bias from that one article? Well, you never know if you stop right there. So we need at least 3. 3 is actually still a very small number, but it at least prevents us from finding one article that is just totally an outlier and kind of off in left field and judging the news outlet based solely on that. Once you get 3, you'll start to have an idea of where the bias is in the publication and also of the quality of the publication as a journalistic outlet. The Due date for this is next class. You will bring it to class on Monday. Due July. What is next Monday? Where did my thingy go? Thingy on the left. It's going to be the 6th. In class. There we go. Due July 6th in class. There we are. As always, email me if you have any questions or concerns. Regarding the format of the assignment itself, let's insert a page break. And on the second page, let's just take off as though we are actually writing the assignment. Now, because we're using MLA format, you're going to put your name. Here, let's do this. There's your name. There's my name. You don't have to put instructor or professor or anything like that, but you know, I'm putting it there so you know that that's the instructor line. The date, you can just put summer 2020, or you can put the specific date. That's either one of those is fine. And you can put English 1213, you can put Comp 2, Composition 2, whatever, anything like that. As long as you have your 4-line double-spaced header. So we are left justified. We are actually single here. I'm going to go double. The reason it was already looking weird is because I had spaces after paragraph. So if you're in Google, make sure you have no spaces before or after paragraph. That option in Microsoft Word is in the paragraph block thingy on the top. So if I was doing that in MS Word, let's copy it, paste it. Whoopsies. Hello. There we go. Paste it. If I was making sure that my spacing was right in MS Word, I'd go to this little tiny box by paragraph, click on it. Don't add space between paragraphs of the same style. Click that. Good, it already had them. Double spaced. Good. So that's the equivalent of your spacing issue in Google Docs. I recommend Google Docs because it is cloud-based, free, and saves your work automatically, so that if a bat flies through the window and knocks over your computer and you lose all your data, it is still saved on the interwebs. That's why I recommend Google Docs over Word, but Word will do just fine if you prefer. That's our 4-line header. We're going to go down 1 line, going to center justify, and we're going to have our title. You can have this extra space here between your 4-line header and your title, or you can not. Technically, I think this is how current MLA wants it. They want no extra space. To me, that looks kind of funky. I like the extra space, so you can do that if you want. It's up to you. Don't care. I'm clicking and dragging to give my 1/2-inch indent. Going back to left justified. Now you notice if I adjust my tabs up here, I have that 0.5, that 1/2-inch indent. That's going to be, anytime I hit enter, it will automatically give me a new paragraph break. That's a lot easier than having to hit tab every time and remember, but if you want to just leave that all the way justified and then hit tab each time you start a new paragraph, totally up to you, that's fine. You can do this a couple of ways. You can just go right out, you can say the first news outlet I examined or analyzed was the New York Times website. I read, well, let's see, we know we read 3 articles. The 3 articles I read were over, let's see, international trade, global warming, and Mexican-American immigration policy, whatever, right? Based on these articles, I found the Times, and in fact, I don't know why I didn't do this in the first place. I'm going to italicize that. Whoopsies. Don't underline it, just italicize it. I found the Times to be biased to the left, moderate left. For example, now this is important. You don't want to just say, I looked at the New York Times, it was left, and it was good. Don't do that. You want to focus on the why. You want to give examples and be specific as to why you believe that any given news outlet is biased in a certain way or is of a certain quality, right? For example, the article on global warming used data from several European scientific communities, including one in Sweden that President Trump in 2018 called fake news science very bad on Twitter, right? So that's how we know that the article was using a left side source, because the president called it bad, right? Something like that, right? Additionally, the article over immigration used personal interviews with several recent immigrants to humanize the issue in favor of broader immigration allowance, or something like that, right? Something that indicates that maybe it was, kind of left-leaning as opposed to focusing on the negative side of immigration from a specific country, something like that. So that's a couple of specific reasons why we found it to be biased to the left. In terms of quality, I found the Times to be strong overall. Let's see. Each of the articles used great detail to support its argument, to support their arguments, and each had several reputable source links embedded within the articles themselves. That sentence is kind of a long, ugly mess, but you get the idea. So here I have used some specific examples as to why I think my first website of 4 is of a certain quality and a certain bias. I should probably go a little more in depth and give another example or two, but this is a pretty good, quick evaluation of that article or of that news outlet. And then once you've got it, you can move right on and just simply say the second news outlet. If you want to have a fancy transition, that's totally fine. If you want to do this in list form, you could even just put like a 1 right there. Although notice that when I did that, it immediately altered the format because it thinks I'm putting together an outline. So I'm going to have to manually drag these back over here, which is kind of a pain in the ass. Hold on. I mean, a pain in the posterior. So you could do it like that if you want. I don't really like the look of that as much as I like just plain old paragraph form. But if you want to have subheaders, you can do that. MLA typically doesn't rely on subheaders, but you could simply say the New York Times, right? And you could have this underlined or bolded or whatever if you want like a header there. Press review. You could call it something fancier, but you don't have to if you don't want to. So you could do that if you want. New York Times, then have a space, and then say Huffington Post, right? I'm italicizing these because they're the names of major publications. I honestly don't know what rules MLA has for subheaders. I don't think they govern subheaders. APA does that. MLA typically does not, I think. I could be wrong. And then we just move on from there. So for each one, you could do that. This would end up being, it looks like, 2 or 3 pages of material. Honestly, I'd probably go into a little more depth than this, as I said, but just as an example, this is kind of how I would format the press review. Once you have all 4 of yours down, then you need to blah, 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 blah. Then you need to have your works consulted page. All right. On Google Drive, Google Docs, you go to Insert, Break, Page Break, and remember you need to change your margin back. Go Center, Works Consulted. Boom, that's it. And we go here. The reason I'm using a page break instead of just hitting Enter a bunch of times is because if I hit Enter a bunch of times, let's say that this was my works consulted. Man, I can type. There we are. All right. Let's say this is my works consulted page. Stop it. There we are. If I just hit enter a bunch of times and I have works consulted at the top of the page there, and then I go back and I add or delete some material, let's say I go and add some material, well then my works consulted page is suddenly all caterwampus, and that's no good. So what you want to do is use your page break. That way, when you have a page break, you can, see now I've undone my page break. Try this again. All right. Insert page break, works consulted. That's not working at all. Well, here I lounge corrected. There we go, that's right. So I'm typing, and the works consulted stays there no matter what I do. If I actually go over to the next page, give me 1 second here. I don't know why it's moving now. Somehow I've messed up my page break by clicking on here and typing here. You might have to mess with it a little bit to make it work. That's very strange. If we are in Microsoft Word, insert, page break, boom. And there's our title, and then if we, and that's doing it there too. It's very odd that the page break isn't behaving as it should. Nope, it stayed there. Okay, cool. So you may have to mess with it a little bit, but you want to make sure that whichever method you use, you are at the top and center for your works consulted. And then we go left, and we need 12 articles on this page. This is going to take a lot of time. Putting together 12 MLA citations takes time. It's one of those things that at the end of it, it looks like it should have taken a very short amount of time, but actually doing it takes a lot of time. So the example I use in, excuse me, sorry, I confused myself for a second. The example I use in the, there we go, figured it out. The example I use in the assignment sheet is this article from the New York Times itself. This is a real article. I'm going to copy it and paste it down here. And we're going to go through step by step how we put together a works consulted list. First of all, I don't want this in blue. I only had it that way so it would stand out in the assignment sheet. Second of all, as with everything else, I need to make sure I'm double spaced. So double spaced. Now, notice the first thing about a works consulted or works cited entry in MLA is that I've got this hanging indent. That is the inverse of the normal paragraph indent. The first line is flush with the left margin, 1 inch margin, and every subsequent line is ½ inch in, right? So that's what you want to have. You want to have the top flush, and you want to have the subsequent lines ½ inch in. What this does is it allows you to see at a glance each article, each entry, because you're going to have 12 entries on this list, so it's going to be a long list, and it's got a bunch of gobbledygook on the page, but at a glance you can see where each entry begins, because the only part that is flush with the left margin is the beginning of each entry. I also noticed, because I've been doing this way too long, that I have a space after paragraph. I want to make sure I remove that. That way I have even spacing between the entries, the same spacing between them as I do within the entry. That's important. Works consulted. Also, this is 11. I don't know why that's 11. Is this 11? That's 11. All right, let's make, oh, I had 10 up there. You know what? Let's grab everything. Let's make it all 10. Boom, done. The basic format for these articles, the good news is, since they're all articles on a journalism website, you are going to use pretty much the same format every time. The only exception would be if you physically picked up a copy of the New York Times and used an article from a physical copy, which you could do, but I'm giving you websites specifically because I know that 99% of the research and information that you get is going to be through the internet. So that's why we're doing websites. We have last name, comma, first name, period. Let's zoom in a little bit, in fact. And then the item itself, the article in this case, is going to be in quotation marks. We have a period inside the quotation marks. Each entry or each item on a works cited entry is bracketed by a period. Each entry is its own sentence. So the entry for name is its own quote-unquote sentence, right? We got a period after it. The entry for the article name is its own sentence. We have a period after it, right? That's how you kind of want to think of it. After that, we have the container, the bigger publication that contains the article itself. That's the New York Times. We italicize that. Containers are italicized. And then we have date of publication. We have a comma, date of publication. We have a comma, the website of access. Then a period, because this is all one item. The New York Times, the date, and where we found it. That's all one item. And then we have date of access, accessed, and then the date. We use day, month, year for the date of access. And that's it. Essentially, that's it. You can use a citation machine. Google up, MLA citation machine. That's one of those websites where you plug in all of this information and it spits out this citation that you can just copy and paste into your Works Consulted page. A couple of caveats about that. You want to make sure that you check each citation after you use the citation machine. If you use a citation machine, which is fine, it's out there, it's available. Why would I want you to memorize this stuff and do it from scratch? That would be silly. Just know how to do it right and double check it, right? That's what matters. So if you want to use it, that's fine, but make sure that you're checking it against the OWL at Purdue, and make sure that you're looking over it after you copy and paste it into your Works Consulted so that you don't have an extra space between entries, or that you don't have that weird kind of gray background you get sometimes when you copy and paste stuff directly off web pages, and that the font and size are all the same, because you don't want to end up with like that weird multiple font Works Consulted page where you've copied and pasted from a bunch of different sources, and then it looks all janky because some of them are like, weird and gray, like all that. I mean, that may not hurt your face, but this hurts my face because I can see immediately the differences in these fonts and stuff, and I know that the student copied and pasted from places and didn't take the time to grab everything and make sure that it was the same color, size, and font. That looks so much cleaner, right? So that paying attention to detail in that way is part of what makes it so difficult to put together a Works Consulted page. But you will have, in alphabetical order by last name, 12 entries on your Works Consulted page. So it'll look kind of like that, right? It'll have that kind of rhythm to it where you've got each entry beginning on the line there. And that's essentially how the assignment will go. The trick to making a good grade on this is putting in the legwork. Be careful reading your articles, refer to them specifically. You can use quotes from the articles in here, which I recommend. And as always, email me or text me if you have any questions. If I think of anything I'm forgetting or leaving out, I'll put it up later in the week.